It's my pleasure today to get a chance to speak with you about sleep health and COVID-19, and also to talk about sleep and aging, and to sort of give you a sense of just how important it is to get the sleep we need, why it's so important, and hopefully to give you some tips at the end on how to address your sleep health. So without further ado, the first thing I want to communicate is that healthy sleep can combat COVID-19. And so I'm going to take you through some science. So bear with me a little bit here while I take you through some science, just to hammer home that it really is important for us to get the sleep we need here. So when we're looking at a pandemic such as COVID-19, one of the things when we're modeling the pandemic, there's really three factors that we want to look at. The first is something called reproduction rate, and that's just simply the speed with which the virus spreads throughout a population. And that's really something that we want to reduce, right? We want to decrease the reproduction rate within the population. And so in order to do that, we have to understand a couple other factors. One of them is transmission rate, and that's the ease with which the disease spreads throughout a population. And so there are two main factors that drive transmission rate. One of the factors is the risk of infection. And another factor is contact rate. And so I'm sure everyone's tired of hearing about COVID-19 at this point, but we're going into the second wave now of COVID-19, and so we really need to address these factors. So contact rate is simply something, the number of people that you're in contact in contact with, and then risk of infection is just how likely you are to get that infection if you're exposed. The other factor that I want to talk about briefly is recovery rate, and that's the speed with which people either recover from the disease and get healthy again, or unfortunately pass. And so that recovery rate is a key factor in the reproduction rate. And so I'm going to explain this to you here. So remember, reproduction rate is what we want to address when combating a pandemic such as COVID-19. So that's reproduction rate. And there are two factors again, transmission rate and recovery rate. And so remember, our goal is to reduce the reproduction rate of COVID-19, for example. And we have two things we can do. We can try to first decrease the transmission rate, and at the same time, we can also try to increase the rate of recovery, or the recovery rate. Now, the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because sleep health actually plays a role in both transmission rate and recovery rate. We can, in fact, decrease the transmission rate by improving our sleep health, and we can increase our recovery rate by increasing our sleep health as well. So the objective here again is to reduce the reproduction rate by improving our sleep health. So when we look at that again, what we're addressing here first is transmission rate. And there's two factors. There's risk of infection and contact rate. Now, a lot of the focus so far, in my opinion, has been on contact rate. Think of it as the physical distancing measures that we've employed around the world and also here in BC. But also social distancing, but also personal protective equipment. Think masks and things like that. So that's addressing the contact rate, and that's an important factor. But there's the other side of the equation that I think we're missing an opportunity on, and that is decreasing the risk of infection by improving our sleep health. Okay, and so I'm going to show you very quickly a study that, now everything that I present here is consensus science, so this is agreed upon among sleep experts around the world. So I'm not presenting any contentious science or anything that hasn't been well established in the scientific literature. But just to give you one example here, this was a study that was done with college students, and these students volunteered to participate in the study. And so in this study, what happened is they were actually deliberately exposed to the common cold. So they were given as a nasal spray that resulted in them actually being 100% exposed to the common cold. This is called the rhinovirus, different than coronavirus, obviously, but the mechanisms here are all the same. And so the individuals were exposed to this common cold, and then what they tracked after the exposure was what percent of those students or those participants actually got the common cold. So they're exposed to the virus, but not everyone gets the cold. Some of them are able to fight it off without getting the cold, and others actually get the cold. And what's really interesting about this study is before these participants were exposed to the cold, the common cold, they tracked their sleep health. And what they did is they used something called actigraphy to measure their sleep the week to 2 weeks in advance of being exposed to this common cold. And the important thing that we see here is that individuals that got better sleep, more sleep in advance of being exposed to the virus, they actually were less likely to get the cold. Okay, and so what I'm showing you here is that your sleep in advance to your exposure to a virus. So in this example, it's the common cold, but again, the mechanisms would be exactly the same for the COVID-19 virus. And so what we see is that sleep in advance of exposure plays a key role in determining your risk of actually getting the virus. And so there's two things I want you to notice in particular. So this first comparison here is looking at individuals that get greater than 7 hours of actual sleep versus people that are getting in the neighborhood of 6 to 7. So about an hour short of what we really recommend. So sleep experts around the world now have agreed that the science is very clear. The recommendation is that everyone get at least 7 hours of actual sleep every night to promote health and wellness. And so what we see here is that if we were to take individuals and get them from 6 hours to 7 hours of actual sleep each night, we would see a 20% reduction in their risk of infection. Now, this is important because we know, looking at epidemiological studies, around the world, we know that sleep is actually the first thing that people sacrifice to meet the growing demands of work, family, and social life balance. And so in the general population, it's a reasonable estimate that people are getting less than 7 hours actual. On average, something in the neighborhood of about 6.5 hours sleep is what most people are getting right now. This is far less than what we used to get. And so it's a function of many things, including technology and electronics at night and changing schedules and all of these things. There's another group that I want to show you, and that is the older adult sleep population, which is actually the same as shift workers. On average, older adults are getting much less sleep, and shift workers as well are getting much less sleep. We could say somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 hours each night. And so when we look at that population, older adults, for example, or shift workers, if we were to improve their sleep health and get them to go from getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 hours and instead get them an additional 2 hours so that they were up to the 7 to 8 range or greater than 7 hours sleep, we could see a 30% reduction in their risk of infection. And this matters. That's the transmission rate part of the equation. But we also know that if someone is unfortunate enough to actually get the virus and end up with, say, a common cold, or in this case, COVID-19, if you get it, the people that get the most sleep, the better sleep, they're actually able to recover faster. And this is also consensus science. We know that there's a number of mechanisms. Think of our immune response to challenges such as a virus. Things like neutrophils, natural killer cells, inflammatory mechanisms, antibodies. All of these are improved by getting better sleep. And so our recovery rate is improved when we get better sleep. So what I'm really trying to convince you of here is that sleep health matters when we're talking about the challenges that the world now faces in terms of COVID-19. We can, in fact, and we need to promote healthy sleep to combat COVID-19. We know that the world is facing this challenge, and right now, a lot of the efforts to combat COVID-19 are focused on PPE, and so think masks, and also social distancing or physical distancing measures. And in the future, in the near future, hopefully within the next few months, let's say February, March, or the early expectations for when a vaccine would be available. That's another measure. But even in that case, one thing that I haven't put in the slides here, but we know from previous science that our immune system's response to a vaccine is actually enhanced when we get better sleep. So not only can we decrease transmission rate and increase recovery rate, but when we have a vaccine available for COVID-19, if we get better sleep, we can actually improve the efficacy of those vaccines. We've known this for other vaccines. Okay, so my main point here is that in addition to addressing the risk factors and using masks and social distancing and these factors, we should really also be including sleep hygiene and sleep health as a factor to combat COVID-19. Now, why am I bringing this to you today? Well, one of the factors is that we know in the older adult population that poor sleep is a common factor. In fact, it's a normal course of aging that sleep would change as we get older. I'm going to show you a chart here that gives you a good idea of what we currently accept as the normal course of aging in terms of sleep health. So what you're looking at here is an actogram. Think research grade Fitbit, but each horizontal row here is a 24-hour day. And so the black vertical lines that you see, that's the activity or the motion that is being captured by this actograph, this sleep recorder. And so the individual wears this actograph 24/7 for a period of about 2 weeks. In this case, you've got 14 days of recordings. And the pink shaded area, that's the time, we call that the sleep window. That's the time when the individual is actually trying to sleep. Now, key point, this is when the person is trying to sleep, but it isn't necessarily that they are able to sleep. So they're trying to sleep, but in many cases, the individual is unable to sleep. And we see that in this chart. Now, key point here, the actograph gives us EEG equivalent estimates of the amount of time the person is sleeping. So that's sleep duration. So in this, the average over the 2-week window, the individual was getting just over 6 hours of sleep. Remember, I was saying that older adults get less sleep on average. The sleep efficiency, that's just a term for the percent of time that the person is actually sleeping for the amount of time that they are trying to sleep. And you can see that this individual, and this is a reasonable example for older adult sleep. Again, you can see their sleep efficiency is about 75%. And so what that means is the person's getting less than 6.5 hours sleep, just over 6 hours. Their sleep efficiency is less than 80%. And their fragmentation, that's just the frequency of sleep disruption. So you can see these black vertical deflections here. That's the person not being able to sleep. So they're disrupted, they're tossing and turning or getting up. They're unable to sleep during this time. Now, here's an interesting point about these charts. When we look at older adult sleep and we talk about the normal changes, there's a few things. Number one, we see that older adults get less sleep than they did earlier in their lives and compared to the general population. We see that their sleep is more fragmented, meaning there's more disruption throughout the night. And we see that the main issue, the main complaint for older adults is an inability to sustain sleep throughout the night. Generally speaking, they're able to fall asleep. But the difficulty they have is that they can't sustain that sleep. And so if I take this sleep window for this example, and I break it into two halves, and I'm just going to toggle this for a moment. But when you break that sleep into two halves, what you see is that the sleep disruption is mainly in the back half of the sleep window. This is an inability to sustain the sleep. And so this is what we would call normal changes as a function of getting older in sleep health. So normal age-related sleep changes. Now, the important thing here is that normal doesn't mean healthy. In this case, we really want to address this sleep health because it's shortening the amount of sleep that the person is getting. And the good news is there are, in fact, things that we can do. And so stay tuned and I'll give you more information about that. But these changes that I'm showing you here, they result in health hazards. We know that the less sleep an individual gets, the greater their risk of common age-related disease such as cardiovascular disease, inflammation, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer, and also dementia. And now these are well established in the literature, and we now know a lot of the mechanisms that sleep is driving increased risk. So we understand these, and I'm going to show you one of them in terms of something that is of interest to many people, and that is dementia or Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia. And so I'm going to show you this in terms of a sleep mechanism and what sleep is doing in terms of brain health. Okay, and so what you're looking at here is sleep need. And so on the bottom here, this is hours of wakefulness. And so when the person wakes up, what they're really doing is the longer the person is awake, they're building up a sleep need. Now, why is that? It's because the brain is like an engine. And when an engine's running, it produces exhaust. And in the same way, our brain produces exhaust while we're active and awake during the day. And that is actually producing a sleep need. In other words, this toxic waste is accumulating in our brain. But have no fear, because we have a mechanism that's designed to quite literally wash away that toxicity. And that's one of the functions. Now, sleep does a lot of things, but one of the functions that sleep does is that it washes away that toxicity that builds up in the brain. Now, as long as you get the sleep you need, and again, just to be clear, the recommendation is that people get at least 7 to 8 hours of actual sleep each night. And if you do that, you end up waking up with a fully refreshed, clean brain, if you will. And so then you start your day anew with that well-washed brain. However, if you don't get that sleep you need, then you end up accumulating a sleep debt. And over time, that accumulation builds toxicity in our brain. So I'm going to show you this here. Imagine these are neurons and they're active. And through the course of the day, they're building up this toxicity around the neurons as a function of normal activity. Now, if we get the sleep we need, again, then we wake up the next day and we've got this clean brain. However, if instead of getting the 7 hours of sleep that we need, let's imagine for a moment that we only get 6. Well, then what happens is we wake up the next day with an accumulation of toxicity. And so what you'll see here, this is the side of the brain that we're looking at, and right here is the frontal cortex. And so what I'm just depicting here so that you can visualize it, is that this sleep debt is this accumulation of toxicity that didn't get washed away because we didn't get enough sleep. And if we continue down that path and each night only getting 6 hours, let's say, then over time we accumulate this toxicity. It's like a tsunami, a wave of toxicity that moves its way through the brain. Now, what does that result in? Well, we know that in terms of Alzheimer's disease, one of the toxic components is the beta amyloid plaques, and you can see them right here. These are plaques that accumulate around the neurons, and they effectively choke off the neurons. So that's essentially what happens in Alzheimer's disease. That's one of the mechanisms. It's not the whole story, but it is one of the mechanisms that's well established. And so these neurons end up getting choked, and then they're not communicating well in the system or the network of other neurons. And then the brain gets a signal that says this neuron isn't playing well with others. You see them with the arrows here. And so the brain actually gets the signal to remove those neurons. And so that's a process called apoptosis, but the neurons get removed. And what you end up with is quite literally a hole in the brain. And that's not a problem if we're talking about one neuron, but when we're talking system-wide and there's many, many neurons that are affected, then you end up with this process. And you ultimately end up with Alzheimer's disease. So the takeaway message here that I want you to understand is that sleep health is critical to brain health. So I don't have to hopefully convince you that sleep's important now. And for most of us, as we get older, we become aware that we're not getting as much sleep. And it's not a function of the individual not wanting to get more sleep. It's just that they aren't able to get that sleep. And they get to a point where they wake up and they're not able to get back to sleep, and they think to themselves, well, I guess I've had enough sleep, and then they begin their day. We heard that with the previous speaker when she was talking about knowing what it's like at 4 in the morning because they wake up at 4 and can't get back to sleep. And also mentioned, she also mentioned that, you know, she knows what programs are on at 4 in the morning because she's up and watching TV. So it turns out that there's a lot of things that we can do to actually improve our sleep as we get older. Okay, so the key message, again, just to review, is that age-related changes in sleep are a normal course of aging. Shortened sleep windows, waking up more often, and having difficulty getting back to sleep. These are all very normal things. The second thing I want to communicate is that while these changes are indeed normal, they need not be inevitable. There are, in fact, things that we can do to improve our sleep health, and the key to that is understanding circadian rhythms. So what are circadian rhythms? Circadian rhythms are daily biological rhythms. What I want you to think of is we have daytime physiology, biology, and behavior, and we have nighttime physiology, biology, and behavior. And the problem that we have as we get older is that we become like a shift worker, if you will, where we turn our nights into days and our days into nights. Shift workers have to work at night, and so as a function of their work schedule, they turn their nights into days and their days into nights. But as older adults, what happens is we go to bed, we sleep for about 4 hours, and then we wake up, and we aren't able to get back to sleep, and so we do things like watching TV, the previous speaker mentioned, or we get up and we start our day. We might think of this as a normal thing. Well, I guess I'm an early bird now, and I just like the early mornings. But the truth is that that activity, what you do when you can't sleep, matters, because you're telling your brain that this is a time to be awake. And so as you progress and you continue to reinforce this mechanism, you'll find it harder and harder to sustain sleep at night. So think of it as this vicious cycle. It starts as something very innocent at first, where you have a little bit of difficulty, and then over time, those difficulties increase. That then result in a rapidly, or I shouldn't say rapidly, but they result in a growing deficit in terms of your sleep health. So how do we change that? What do we do? Well, it turns out that time cues matter. And what I mean by time cues is we have this, think of it as a conductor that is the pacemaker that sets our circadian rhythms. It tells our circadian rhythms, this is day and this is night. And during the day, this is the set of physiological functions that need to happen. And during the night, it's a whole different set of physiological functions. And the issue is that these are incompatible processes. They need to be kept separate by time. So again, daytime physiology, biology, and behavior, nighttime physiology, biology, and behavior. And we need to tell our clock, our pacemaker, what time it is. Okay, and so how do you do that? Well, we evolved as hunter-gatherers around the plains, and our days were exposed to a lot of sunlight, lots of sunlight during the day, but at night we didn't get light. In fact, we had much less light that we now have because we have artificial sources of light, and we've got electronics and all of these things that actually bring the light into our night. And when we are getting that light at night, we are actually telling our pacemaker, our time cue, that night is actually day. So that's one of the things, is that we need to be very clear that light is a daytime signal and darkness is a nighttime signal. Now, I realize I'm pummeling you with information here and we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to give you some keys, and I'll also provide my email address at the end. So if you have questions, I'll answer questions, but if you want to contact me directly, you'll be able to by email. So light is a fundamental factor. Another is meal times. And this is another dramatic change from what we evolved. We evolved again as hunter-gatherers, and it took a lot of effort and energy for us to get the resources and the food that we needed, hunting and gathering to get our food. And we would eat during the day, and our eating was done, think of it as for metabolic need. But now we have food at our disposal. We have access to food 24/7 if we choose. And very often, people will get up at night and they'll think, oh, I need to have something to eat to help me get back to sleep. Eating food is a daytime signal. Fasting, or the absence of food, is a nighttime signal. And one of the mistakes we make as a society now is that we have a tendency to eat our biggest meal a few hours before bedtime. We're busy, we live busy lives, and so often that dinner meal, our biggest meal of the day, is actually just a couple of hours before we go to bed. And what that does is it gives our brain the daytime signal right before we're supposed to be going to sleep. And in fact, we're digesting food, and that alters our sleep chemistry. It changes the way our brain is able to get the sleep it needs. And so we really need to separate eating food from our nighttime sleeping. And so a key message here is that you need to eat meals in the early part of the day and then be finished eating about 4 to 5 hours before your bedtime, giving yourself a long fast. Think of that. You go to bed, you've finished eating about 4 to 5 hours before you went to bed, and then you sleep for your hopefully 8-hour sleep window, giving yourself a long fast, meaning a long period of time without food. That's a strong signal for your brain that says this is nighttime. Eating food, daytime. Fasting is nighttime. And then finally, physical activity. We've become much more sedentary as a society than we were and what we evolved to be. During the day, that's a time for lots of activity. And I want to distinguish exercise from physical activity. And in particular, I want to talk about physical activity as just being active. And the opposite of that is sedentary time. Time when we're sitting down, not active, watching TV, reading, doing work, whatever that might be. That's sedentary time. Now, in our lives, a lot of us have a great deal of sedentary time during the day, and that is providing the wrong signal to our brains that this is day. So physical activity, or breaking up the sedentary time, is a key part of providing your brain with the signal that this is day. And the rule of thumb that I want you to use is break up sedentary time every 30 to 60 minutes. So if you've been sitting down for 30 to 60 minutes, you want to break that up. And it doesn't mean you have to get on a treadmill and work really hard or do anything like that. It's just getting up, do a lap around your house, just get your blood flowing a little bit for a couple of minutes. We're not talking about sustained activity necessarily, although being active obviously and getting exercise is key. I'm just talking about here breaking up the sedentary time. What you want then, just to summarize, is to provide your brain with lots of cues that this is day. And the daytime cues, to summarize again, are lots of UV protected sunlight, food, meal times, regular meal times. And a good rule of thumb that I didn't mention is to have your biggest meal of the day as your breakfast. Think breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And forgive the gender bias there. Big meal to start your day, and then progressively smaller meals as you get through the day, and a big gap, 4 to 5 hours before going to bed. And then finally, the other daytime signal is decreasing sedentary time, being active throughout the day and not being sedentary for longer than 30 to 60 minutes. And then the final piece of this is that you need to be consistent. Routine sleep windows are absolutely critical. You want to tell your body that this is bedtime, and be routine with that, because your brain and your body learn to anticipate the sleep window. Think of it this way. If you build the sleep window, over time, sleep will fill that sleep window as long as you're consistent with it. So you want to build your sleep window, protect the sleep window, and sleep will fill it. The key message being that you want to avoid light at night, you want to avoid food at night, and you want to be sedentary at nighttime. So getting up, the final message, what you do when you can't sleep matters. So if you are getting up and watching TV or getting up and making food and doing things like that, it will actually impair your ability to get sleep at that time in the future. Remember that what you do when you can't sleep matters. The final piece is here. It's possible for you to actually, we have the technology now, it's possible for you to actually objectively measure your sleep. You can get something like the Fitbit and get yourself a Fitbit. They're not that expensive anymore, and they measure sleep stages. Again, this is Fitbit data, aggregate data. It's been measured with millions of users around the world, and you can see here that the average sleep as of this publishing was 6 hours and 38 minutes. This is average data for all users, okay? And we can see that as a society, we're just not getting enough sleep. This is what I call elite sleep. This is the data that you would be able to get if you got yourself a Fitbit. Key point here is that you can see, full disclosure, this is my sleep data, and it shouldn't be a surprise to you that, I work very hard to make sure I get good sleep. And so you can see here that I get deep sleep. As soon as I fall asleep, I'm able to get into the deep sleep. That's the sleep that washes the brain. And then I'm cycling through from deep into REM sleep. This here is REM. And you'll see that these cycles, they happen every 90 minutes or so. You'll be able to see that it's not just how many hours you've spent sleeping that matters, but it's the structure or the architecture, the sleep architecture, how that sleep is made up. And you'll be able to track that if you get yourself a Fitbit. And so to give you a sense of just a bit of hope here, it is entirely possible to improve your sleep health. And this is tracking your sleep health over time, doing the things that I've talked about. And if you want additional help, I'm here for you. But what you can see, this is just an example of a client of mine who came to me. This is an older adult. and he was having difficulty being able to sustain sleep. He was aware that he was, having greater and greater difficulty being able to stay asleep, and would find himself getting up at about 4 or 5. And he wanted to be able to get back to sleep, but he couldn't. And over the course of working with me, now this is 6 to 8 weeks here, going through a program with me, you can see that he actually improves his sleep. And actually, if we zero in here, you can see the dark blue on the bottom here. This is deep sleep. That's the sleep that washes the brain. You can see a dramatic improvement in the deep sleep, but you can also see that his REM sleep numbers improved as well. And REM sleep is really important for consolidation of learning and memory. What you see overall, the sleep has improved, and we're getting to the 8 hours that we would like to see. But not only that, the structure and the architecture of the sleep is improved as well. So it is possible to get the sleep you need, even though you're getting older and that you're experiencing these normal age-related changes.